The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Laura Kaminsky, the director of all lectures here at the 92nd Street Y, was kind enough to ask me to make some introductions this evening. I suppose because I directed a performing arts program, and the people that I'm about to introduce are very dear to me, as I think they are to you too. To begin with, I'd very much like to thank Tim Page. All of you who have been here for the last 3 lectures of the Great Conductors series will have seen to be not only a cogent interviewer, but extraordinary critic and wonderful radio commentator, and I appreciate him very much. I know you do too. I feel somehow a kindred spirit to our guest this evening, Michael Tilson Thomas. He really actually needs no introduction because we've known his meteoric rise over the last 10 or so years, I think, quite intimately. He's written something in his biography, and I feel somehow happy that he's written it because it allows me to comment on it, and that is that he is the grandson of the great Yiddish actors Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski. But that in itself is less interesting than the fact that I'm the son of a great playwright, Peretz Hirschbein, and I danced at my bar mitzvah with Bessie Tomaszewski. So the little boy has grown up. Both little boys have grown up. You know, Michael Tilson Thomas's most recent appointment is in a way a landmark because he has been appointed the music director of the 1986 Great Woods Festival. Now that is the new summer home of the Pittsburgh Symphony. It is a new enterprise, and he is a conductor worthy of guiding that through its formative years and onward. It occurs to me also that you should know, so that you can purchase those records, that he's currently recording a cycle of the Beethoven symphonies with the English Chamber Orchestra. And it pains me a little to admit it, but it is an orchestra also akin to the Y Chamber Symphony in the sense that it is a classical-sized Beethoven orchestra, and he's gotten to it first. Oh, woe is unto us all. However, congratulations to him. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's quite enough to be able to say that we have Tim Page and we have Michael Tilson Thomas coming to speak to us, and it's enough of me. I would like to ask them to come onto the stage. Michael Tilson Thomas and Tim Page, please come on the stage and sit down.
Good evening, and welcome to the last of our programs talking with some of today's most distinguished conductors. Thanks very much for coming this evening. We'll try not to disappoint you. We're going to be talking with Michael Tilson Thomas in the next hour and a half or so, and we will open the floor to questions once I ask him a few questions myself. And since this is the final evening, and I want to
I'm just conducting a little, pay no attention.
Are we all set?
Wait a second.
We're all set.
Now.
I think I'll keep this very formal and ask you the question which I asked Lucas Foss, Gerard Schwartz, and Leonard Slatkin in that order. And surprisingly, I got very, very different response each time. So I will ask you again on this last night of the series, what is it exactly that a conductor does? I think often audiences, people attend and they hear of such groups as Orpheus, which manages to function without a conductor, or the Collegium Aureum, which also plays without a conductor, although the concertmaster will sometimes take over the job there. What is it, though, that makes a conductor necessary, desirable, and so on? What is it exactly that you do?
I encourage, caution, unify, and assign priorities. I do those four things.
Could you expand on that a little bit? I realize I'm asking you sort of an impossible question, and I realize I'm asking for a rather impossible answer, but
I try to make the ensemble I'm working with feel inspired, enlivened to approach the task with great enthusiasm and with heart and with spirit. I caution them to not go too far in not respecting the score or not respecting the integrity of one another's performance or the boundaries of taste which exist in individual work and individual style. I unify them in trying to present a structural view, a universal, abstract, but nonetheless power-filled conception of the piece, which will bring diverse elements, diverse personalities, diverse talents into concord so as to best reflect the spirit of the work as carried out by the particular talents which are in that group. And finally, from all the different things that the work may call for in the course of its length or at a particular moment, I try to assign what is the major thing that must first be thought of. What is the major idea of the piece? What is the major mood of the piece? What is the major message of the piece? And then within that, where is that most clearly in focus? In what way is it in focus? How does it go from the larger sense of a general term like relaxation or tension or whatever? It may be of melancholy or of rage or confession or whatever is the spirit of it, from the largest poetic sense to the most specific details of execution of every aspect of it, and try and assign what it is that makes that particular piece, what makes that particular composer what he uniquely is, and what makes that particular piece what it uniquely is within that composer's output. That's what I do.
You know, I think it would be absolutely fascinating for us to hear back some of the different answers we've gotten when I've asked that question, because I've asked 4 different men that question and gotten 4 very different answers. I've gotten, one of our answers was extremely mystical. We had a conductor who was basically talking entirely about the spiritual qualities of the music. Another one who was talking basically more or less about being a traffic cop, almost, in a funny way. And from you, it seems rather a humanistic answer, artistic answer, which I find really quite fascinating. And I will go on from there to touch on your use of the language. Critics are often attacked, or at least people will ask why we used expressions such as sad or happy or ecstatic or various qualifiers like those. And they'll say, they'll feed back that famous quote from Stravinsky about how the business of the only thing that music can express is itself. Yet you seem quite comfortable talking about the deeper, the emotional qualities of a piece of music, rather than just talking about, say, the fortes and the counterpoint and so on.
Of course.
Well, it's not as simple as that. A lot of people really won't talk that way. They look at you as if you're an escaped madman if you ascribe to music something along those lines.
That's just because they're uncomfortable and defensive with a side of their nature which they find difficult to make public.
But these are great musicians I'm talking about. I'm talking about some very, very gifted and sensitive musicians who have moved me many times. And then you get them, you sit them down and you ask them questions about the emotional impact of music, and they are absolutely reticent to discuss it. And they seem indeed almost embarrassed that it's there.
Being reticent to discuss it doesn't mean they feel it. It means exactly what you said. They are reticent to discuss it. They are reticent to reveal part of their eternal internal world to you or to the press or to whoever it is. It's a very personal, special thing for them, and they want to keep it that way. What the public perceives of it in their performance, That's what they want to be shown. Very often, what we do as performers, we deal in artifice. We want the public to think a certain thing, to perceive a certain thing, to have a certain experience. The way we do it, the way we create that, the way we evoke that, is our own business. We don't necessarily want to tell you that.
You touched upon the idea of artifice, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you insinuating or saying that when you go out there are some times where you don't really believe the music and that you're basically letting your craft carry you through? Or do you believe it every time you stand up there to conduct a symphony you've conducted 100 times?
You asked two different questions. The first question, when I say artifice, I mean anytime that you create something which is meant to be perceived in a certain way, but actually is not that way. That's nice. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I talk with my students very often about really like the Parthenon is a classic example. I mean, so a student will come and say, well, is this really exactly in tempo? Should this be really exactly rhythmically strict, or should it be exactly in tempo, or should it be this, or it should be that, or all these kinds of questions they ask. And I always say, but this is a completely irrelevant question. The question is, what do you want this piece to be like? How do you want people to perceive this? If you want them to perceive it a particular way, then you must find the way that that will be accomplished. Exactly in the same way, the architects of the Parthenon wanted the columns to seem straight up and down. They wanted them to seem equidistant. Therefore, they distorted all the proportions and all the angles so that the illusion of being that would be created. It's no different at all in making music. There are ways of making the intent of the music as you see it clearer through the art of interpretation, performance, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does one become a conductor? You started very, very early, and it must have taken a remarkable leap of faith at the age of, 23, 24, when you first started conducting the Boston Symphony, to step up on that stage. I remember you then from 1970, because I was up there myself, and we held you in such incredibly high esteem that somebody who was more or less our own generation could actually go up there and work with these people who'd been working at it for years and years and years, and come up there and authoritatively take command and take charge and create very beautiful and memorable performances. How did you do that? How did you do that at such an early age? Presume to tell a group of musicians who've been working on it for such a long time, and have that confidence, that sense of oneself.
I didn't think about it an awful lot. I mean, wasn't thinking about that it was extraordinary or remarkable. Like many other things in life that happen, by the time they happen, it no longer seems to you that remarkable that they have happened. And it all took place very, very quickly, and I was just thinking about getting my mind organized for the next thing that I had to do.
It must have been terrifying.
Certain moments were scary. I always found, and I still do, I must say, find the rehearsals much more frightening than the performances. Because the performances, I feel that whatever has happened, and now it's the moment that you have to go out and just be clear and open to the spirit of the music and to the sharing that you are experiencing with the performers and with the audience. In the rehearsals, you feel you are responsible. I mean, you are at that moment, you have to decide, you have to do something. It's really critical what you do with those precious moments of rehearsal in shaping the music. That is the time of your stewardship. That is the time of your greatest responsibility. And it's about these rehearsals that I have really the highest anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the case then. But also at that time, I was doing a lot of repertory, which was in the kind of hard edge karate chop school of music, which I had learned very well from Stravinsky and from Boulez and people like this. So I was quite confident in this repertory. I knew this music better than the ensembles with which I was working knew it. So that gave me the strength to do this. On the other hand, when it came to certain pieces in the romantic repertory or in the standard repertory of these orchestras, I had less experience than they did. So it was a more tentative exploration. And it was to discover a new path to that repertory that I took many steps in my life, which led me to some orchestras which were less in the public spotlight, and even more importantly, to repertory which was less known, which was by very great composers, but less known and less predetermined in the perceptions of the listener or in the orchestra.
Mm-hmm. In other words, to some degree, they would support what you were, excuse me, they'd support what you were doing, say, in a work by Carl Ruggles. I remember you were one person who played Sun Treader,
right,
and really helped bring it to our consciousness. But they might have been a little more nervous about following you in Beethoven at that point.
Certainly.
Well, how does one become a conductor? How did you become a conductor? I realize that every conductor comes to it by a different path. We had Leonard Slatkin here last week, and he talked quite a bit about following a life of music after having the Hollywood String Quartet rehearse in his living room for all those years. Mm-hmm. And you were also a Los Angeles boy. And
right.
How did you become a conductor?
I was around a lot of sick people. And again and again, I found myself in a situation where I was a performer and the conductor got sick. And somebody had to conduct.
That kind of sickness.
Yes. Yes, the other two, really. But so this kept happening again. The first time it happened was in junior high school. I was in a orchestra. Was it, I don't know, advanced orchestra, I think it was called. And the instructor didn't appear one day, and a substitute teacher was sent who was a physical education instructor. And he seemed greatly mystified by what was happening. So he finally just said, well, can anybody do this? And I said, yes, I can. And that was the very first time I conducted an ensemble, and it was by no means the last time that I would take over in a situation at the last minute.
And where did it go from there? I'm not just interested in a sort of biographical sense, but I think it would be interesting for our audience to know how it happens, because one can more or less assume to some degree how one becomes a doctor or a lawyer, because it's a path which a fair amount of people follow, but there are so few conductors, and so many people often, I'm sure, to themselves, maybe conducting along with their favorite piece or just dreaming about the whole business. I'm from the generation where I think every child who was involved in music wanted to be Leonard Bernstein. So everybody has had, I think, if they care a great deal about music, some fantasies about being a conductor, but you've actually done it. And it's more than just conducting a high school orchestra. Where did it go from there? It might be instructive for us to know.
Well, I was very interested in science and in music both. And in fact, in some ways, my early life was more about science. It was more about projects and accomplishments in the sciences than it really was in music. But around the time of high school, the two began to reverse, because I began getting very good training in music, and the realms of music began to open up for me. And by that, I mean that music for me is it is a kind of dialogue, it is a kind of calculus in which the rational and the non-rational come into relationship with one another. And I believe about music like I believe about all art, that is an expression of these two kinds of forces, these two kinds of spirits, these two kinds of thought that man takes notice of, discovers it himself. And that the music is a piece of music, a particular phrase, but maybe easier to think of it, a particular piece of music has a balance point in it. It has a certain balance point in it between the rational and the non-rational, the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the intellectual and the spiritual, however you choose to apply those terms. And that particular balance point is the fulcrum of a particular mind. It is a particular spirit, is a particular human being who found this balance point. at this particular time in his life and who set this down as a kind of testimony, which is a very courageous and amazing thing for someone to do. And the process of making music, the process of loving music, of loving the arts, of knowing the arts, is being able to not only love the object that's been manufactured, the painting, the pot, the piece of music, whatever it is, but to really develop an appreciation and knowledge of the mind that created it, of the spirit, the personality, and the mind that left this testimony. That is what attracts me about music. That is why I continue to study music, because of this relationship that I have through music with all kinds of people, minds and spirits who've lived their lives, who've set down this record of their experiences to delight, but even more to instruct me and help me in the balancing and determination in my own life of where I stand and where I find myself as a human being and how I can help others to do that same thing.
You touched on instruction, and you are now teaching conducting. How does one teach this? How does one pass this on?
It's very direct, and I'll get to that in 1 second. Okay. So, the teaching, going back to your earlier question, this world began to open up for me because of the excellence of the teaching that I was receiving in music in my teenage years, exactly at the time that the instruction I was receiving in mathematics became more of a prosaic form of instruction, because that was public school instruction. So it was natural that this part of my mind would go toward music rather than toward science, plus the fact that I came from a family which had very strong roots in theater and music and show business, so these things all combined. And as for conducting, it was natural that beyond the question of executing something myself with my fingers, that I was attracted more and more by the idea of more and more voices, more and more parts, more and more aspects to this music which could be perceived, which could be shaped, which could be expanded, and this really was the course of what learning to be a conductor, being driven to be a conductor, was for me. Now, your next question, teaching conducting. Learning music is like anything else. You learn it by doing it, making mistakes, figuring out certain things which are natural for you. Some people are much more natural than others in doing it. But it's like learning to roll a coil of clay. That was the most important thing, one of the most important things I ever learned in my life. My parents took me to ceramics class when I was around 10 years old. And in this ceramics class, you make whatever you make, those projects, and you have to roll a coil of clay. When you roll a coil of clay, you work with clay, at first you're sort of pushing at the clay, and you can't make a coil. It flattens out and it dries out and it cracks and all these things happen to it. It's no good. And then after a time, you get to the point where you learn exactly this degree of pressure that it's almost like you suggest to the clay that it wants to become a coil. And it does. It just goes, whoop, there it is. Or you learn on the wheel that you suggest use the clay. You just say, come up, yes, okay, yes. Now you're a jar, now you're a bottle, now you're a flute, now you have a bend, now you don't, now you're off, now you're a lump again, whatever it is. And that's the same sense in which I teach people to conduct. There is a knowledge, there is an understanding that musicians have because their hands are in the medium, actually in the medium. They craft it, they move it. They have a knowledge, they have an understanding, they have an appreciation, and moreover, folks, they know what is really good in a way that no one who is outside of that can possibly know. They don't have to necessarily like it. There's a difference between liking something and knowing whether it's good or not. That's a very special thing. As a craftsman, as a musician with my hands in the clay, I can say, I hated this performance, but it was good. It was really good. Maybe it was even great. I don't want to ever hear it again, but it was a great performance. It's not my style. And that's the kind of sense that you have, and it comes from saying, what is this phrase? How does this work? And there are a million analogies. Some of them are structural, and some of them are experiential, and some of them are just what do you do with your wrist, and some of them are, I mean, it's at every single level.
How do you feel when you conduct a piece that you don't really like very much?
That doesn't happen.
Never?
Almost never. The number of times I've conducted a piece I didn't like, or maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 in my whole life.
That's remarkable that you've managed to, either you have remarkably Catholic taste, which I actually know you do, or you've been able to have a good deal of command over your career.
More the latter, I would say.
One of the things which is important to me is the fact that you've championed quite a bit of new music in many, many different styles, everything from Carl Ruggles. And it's hard to speak of new music when you're speaking of somebody who was born way back in the 1870s, but he did live until 1971.
Right.
And you were conducting him before many other people were at all interested. And you've also worked very closely with a lot of younger composers who write in a very, very different style, including Steve Reich. Matter of fact, one time I interviewed Steve Reich, and he told me about a time when you were, I guess, not actually conducting, because it's not a piece which so much needs conducting as it does maraca shakes, but you participated in a work called Four Organs and came pretty close to a modern-day equivalent of the Rite of Spring riot at Carnegie Hall.
That's very true, yeah. We had members of the audience, quite a number of members of the audience who were screaming and yelling, and to the point that we couldn't hear one another playing, so we were having to go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, kind of mouth the counts of the piece in order to stay together.
2 questions here, but they're really interrelated. Number one, what is it that draws you to so much contemporary music? Number 2, how does it feel when a piece which has challenged you and inspired you and you've believed in enough to put it on a program with Franz Liszt and C.P.E. Bach, how do you feel when suddenly there's an audience which is howling for blood?
I loved it. I really loved that experience. No, the worst is when there's no reaction. If people applaud a lot, great. If people stamp their feet, great. If they hiss, boo, whatever, scream, that's great. Oh, that's all wonderful. If they just sit there and kind of continue to exist in the grayed out existence of most of society, that's unfortunate. I try to not let that happen.
You know, that's something I find myself in my radio programming, is there's a lot of new music which I can program and I'll never get any angry letters, and I'll also never get any positive letters.
That's right.
And then there's other kinds of music where I'll get just these scathing letters accusing me of every possible kind of misconduct, and other letters, saying that I somehow took them to paradise this afternoon with this program. It's fascinating. I never ever get hate mail or love mail on a whole school of music, perhaps because people are very used to it, but there's other kinds of music which attracts this really strong reaction, and Steve Reich's music is certainly in that category.
Sure is.
So, what do you look for in a contemporary piece when you are trying to decide to program it? There are so many different styles that it's almost impossible to use one set of criteria for all of them. Is it basically just a gut instinct, or do you actually sit down and weigh all sorts of philosophical and musical concepts? Or something?
No, I actually approach most music by sitting at the piano and playing the piece on the piano. Sometimes I hear tapes of pieces, but very often, most often, I have a score and I look it over, and if it looks interesting, I sit down at the piano and I start playing it and get some kind of sense of what it really is. And the thing that I'm interested in music, I'm interested in notes. I'm very conservative in that way. I didn't start out being so conservative, considering that I came into music playing a lot with Cage and Stockhausen and Boulez and a lot of people in this kind of school. I'm very interested in notes, the actual pitches, and the particular thing that they seem to talk about, the directions of each phrase, the overall sense of tonal placement of the music, what that actually stands for. I'm not very interested in effects, textures, electronics, indeterminacies. I'm not interested in any of those things as gratuitous side interests that will disguise the fact that the notes don't really mean anything. The notes must mean something. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that I think that music must be all consonant. Not at all. I'm very partial to some music which is very, very dissonant. But the music, I feel, has the dissonances are of consequence and move in and out of one another in a way that has lasting meaning for me.
We've touched on what happens when you play music that you don't like very much. What are the pieces that you really, really enjoy conducting? Not just, I'm sure there are some which are deeply fulfilling spiritually, and then I'm sure there are some which are just a tremendous amount of fun to get up there and really get an orchestra behind you, which may not be necessarily as great music or deeply rewarding, but must be just sheer tactile fun to conduct.
I mean, when one performs particular music, you get so involved in doing that music, it's hard to imagine anything other than what you're performing. So, I mean, at this moment, I've just finished performing programs involving the Schumann Third Symphony. That's two ends Schumann. And I'm just, I can't stop hearing it in my mind. It's just such an amazing piece, such a really incredibly profound, glorious piece of music. Every time you do that piece, there are still more to be found in it. The very awkwardness of its style of orchestration is in fact an enormous challenge, and in a way protects some of the heartfelt music that's in it from being exploited, as some of Brahms' music has fallen prey to. And so there's an example of a piece that I really enjoy doing in the musical sense, and in the kinesthetic sense that you mentioned. I guess La Valse is a kind of classic example. La Valse is a piece that I really know how to do. I know exactly how to set it in order and what to do and how to accomplish these magical feats of daring that go on in that piece. And it's great fun to kind of unify an orchestra in doing that, and moreover for them to discover that there are ways in which the kind of breathless, heart-stopping kinds of things that happen in the piece can be made much more predictable. I mean, repeatable, so you can kind of count on the fact that they're going to happen. That's a very, very nice feeling, because if you have that as a structure underneath, it means that in the actual performance you can approach vertiginous peaks of near catastrophe and bring it back in the nick of time. That's a lot of fun.
I don't know about our audience, but I recognize some of the faces out here, and one of the things which is fascinating me tonight is just how very, very differently all four of our conductors have approached their art. It's not so much that we're getting completely diametrically opposed opinions. It's just that all four conductors who approach something which is, after all, a concrete and logical discipline seem to approach it from such radically different perspectives that it reminds me of that old story about the 5 blind men and the elephant, who were all given different parts of the elephant to hold, and one who was holding the tail said about how thin and wiry the elephant was. Another one who was holding one of the feet went on and on about how much like a tree the elephant was. And I think it's fascinating, and we're getting a good idea about the various different ways one can approach conducting. For instance, you're the first person who hasn't mentioned Tchaikovsky in your list of favorite pieces to conduct. Everybody else...
I just gave you 2 pieces, though.
True, that's true. But almost everybody else has instantly sprung into the conversation with the Tchaikovsky Fifth. It's been amazing. 3 completely different conductors. I guess I have to ask you, how do you feel about conducting the Tchaikovsky Fifth?
I feel conducting the Tchaikovsky Fifth is a sacred trust. And that is a piece which people have the most prosaic, played out, hackneyed conceptions about this piece. And this piece is actually a very, very great masterpiece. One of the great romantic symphonies. But to work on this piece, to make the orchestra accept this piece in their hearts, and therefore through the work that they do, as what the piece actually is. And to make that come across the footlights, that is really something. That's just the same as conducting any of the pieces that people more customarily think of as being great spiritual utterances, whatever, like a Bruckner symphony or a Mahler symphony or something. It's right in that world, in the kind of simplicity and ardency that it demands. It's not about virtuosity, that piece. It must be played virtuosically, but it's about much more.
Well, I would agree with you certainly on that, but I'm curious, when you talk about trying to get your intentions across to the orchestra, how does one convince, say, a hostile or a difficult orchestra? I'm not saying you deal with a lot of hostile orchestras, but there must have been times when you've dealt with an orchestra which, for one reason or another, they're used to one conductor. Your youth, the fact that you're an American, must have somehow rubbed them the wrong way. And how does one get one's intentions across without just being a strict taskmaster? Or maybe one has to be that now and then.
People have different methods. I refuse to be a stern taskmaster. I simply come and I have the answers. And people discover that I have the answers, and that's very reasonable. And my answers make things sound better, and make them have a better time, and make them love the music more again. And as long as I have those answers, everything proceeds in a reasonable way.
But surely there must be some orchestra somewhere in the world which doesn't think you have the answers. It's never happened.
Worse, there have been times when I didn't have the answers. But that's what I'm always working to discover more. And so, you sometimes encounter a particular person who is obstreperous, and generally that's just because they want to call attention to themselves. They just want attention. So you kind of have to look at them and say, now, this person wants attention. Now, what kind of attention does he want? Does he want to be caressed? Does he want to be spanked? Does he want to be, toyed with? What does this person want? He wants something. Okay, well, let's just figure out what it is, and so we get rid of that, on to music making. And there are various ways of doing that. You can't always speak in the same vocabulary. You can't always speak in the same kinds of terms. Sometimes the best thing to do is to say something very specific technically, because you have many different people and they're of different spirits, and you have to give an idea of what they collectively understand. It's just like working with actors. This whole thing of people saying, well, does a conductor really remake the performance, and how much is... Well, it's exactly like the players have to play the music. They actually play it. And they have certain strengths and weaknesses, and just like somebody going out on the stage and reading lines, the director may have a certain concept of the piece, but he must take into consideration who he's working with and what is an interpretation that works for them, that serves the piece. Mm-hmm. So you have to find that, and a while back, I was with an orchestra that I'd never worked with before, and I came in the very first rehearsal and was shaping something in the Mahler Fifth. And it's the nature of the way I work that from the very first moment in the rehearsal, even in the reading, I'm beginning to lay down the big titanic architectural scheme of the piece and delineating areas which have a general, like I said before, assigning priorities. This is this theme, the general nature of all this material. This like this, and all right, now we're in this other section, this is like this. So even in the reading, the piece begins to lock in. Now this is this idea, but now in this other style. I'm being too quick and glib about this. Anyway, in shaping things after the initial reading, I said, all right, now this third subject, which is a kind of used by Mahler as a kind of hope theme, you must play these triplets very vulnerably, really relaxed and vulnerable and so on. And this concert master said, well, we really don't know what you mean by vulnerable, Mr. Thomas. And I said, well, what I mean is you should begin them on an up bow, rather flautando in the upper third of the bow, probably on the A string. You should keep the intensity vibrato going so that it reaches its maximum focus as you go across the bar line. As you make the portamento downwards, avoid making any crescendo at all, disguise the bow change over the next 3 notes, and lift the bow off the string while vibrating so there's no edge at the end of the phrase. He said, I see. There was total silence, and I said, now look, we're working together for the first time. I can talk to you in a lot of ways. I can talk to you like a poet, I can talk to you like a musician, I can talk to you as a fellow human being, I can talk to you as a colleague, or I can talk to you like a foreman, if that's what you want. Make up your mind. How are we going to do it? We got to make the music good. And from then on, everything was great. Or like Leonard Bernstein, was the most fantastic squelch of someone in an orchestra I ever heard. Lenny was giving an oration in rehearsal, something which he is inclined to do and entitled to do. And he was saying something, and some member of the wind section said, yeah, Lenny, what do you want it, louder or softer? You know, like, oh God, it's such an old line. And there was complete silence, and he said, I'd like it louder and softer and a lot of other things. That was the end of that guy. We didn't hear from him for a couple seasons after that. He didn't open his mouth. But these things really are relatively rare. I come back to the idea of saying, you must understand from the standpoint of the orchestra, these people are playing so much music. This music is going by at an incredible rate every week. One program, maybe two programs. For them to keep ahead of, to be asked to think of what would be the rallying points, that comes back to another question that you mentioned earlier, Tim, about what is the role of the conductor? Well, sure, in an orchestra like an ensemble like Orpheus, where the repertory is more limited, where they tour, where they play certain pieces many, many times, it's great. They establish 2 or 3 people in the orchestra who take responsibility for arranging the concept. They work on it together, but it takes time. The thing about a conductor is a conductor, and like a director, can be very efficient. And he can come in, there are all these different people, they have all these different things on their minds, and he comes and says, okay, it's like, or quarterback, whatever you want to use. He says, here are the signals, it's this, this, this. We get this, we get that, we get that. You maybe make an end run over there, whatever. And it's set. It's established so that the music can flow and can happen. And if you do that, and this is perhaps not the most favorable comment on our musical society, but I would say that the most rewarded characteristic today in music making probably is efficiency. That's just the nature of the tempo of it, the speed of it, the demands of it, the cost of it, everything else. If you can bring the show in, you can bring it in the amount of time that you're given, and it's respectable, it works, that's great as far as most orchestras are concerned. Then, if it has a little touch of imagination, a little insight, a little humor, a little, few thrills along the way, that's really a bonus. That's great then. So sure to ask you back then.
And that leads to another question, which is how much of what we hear in a concert is happening spontaneously, and how much has been prepared in rehearsal?
It varies a lot between one performer and another. People have different styles of working. My style of working is to rehearse very intensely from the very first moment with complete concentration, and really try and establish a very firm foundation and sense of trust and flow also, awareness to one another. Moments when I want them to really catch things from me, and other moments where I'm giving them their heads, so to speak, and following them, and that's really solid from the rehearsals, so that when we come to the performance, we can play very freely and very much subject to a twist, a turn, a little thought that crosses our mind, or a little opportunity which may come up in the electricity of the performance.
Now, what about the idea of a sound? We hear a lot about the Stokowski sound, the Karajan sound. Is there a Michael Tilson Thomas sound? Leonard Bernstein is absolutely flatly denied and repudiates as strongly as possible, at least verbally. I'm not sure his performance repudiate this, but repudiates the idea that there is a Bernstein sound, that it's all whatever the piece demands. But would you say there is a Michael Tilson Thomas sound? Is there a special sonority that you prize?
I believe a lot in that the sonority should change according to the piece. And there are certain It's a question of priorities. In some pieces, the priority is the sound. In other pieces, the articulation is the priority, or some other aspect of it. But there's nothing worse than hearing an entire performance of music, which is a little bit like the way this microphone reproduces, or the way you hear in announcements in airports. There are a lot of performances that sound like,
"Now boarding at gate 53, the flight to Munich, all aboard, please."
You know those performances?
Very well.
I can't stand those performances. Because I feel just the same way when I'm hearing, I feel just that same frustration that I feel when I'm in an airport saying, "God, is that my plane? Am I supposed to go to whatever?" I can't stand it.
Well, now you do a great deal of guest conducting. I'm curious as to the differences you hear in orchestras. This is another one of those things that you often hear people talk about, the idea that the orchestra is really based on the conductor, that if you take Herbert von Karajan and you bring him to New York, you'll have a sound like the Berlin Philharmonic somehow. I've actually seen this written. I don't think I necessarily agree with it, but I'd be curious to see what you think about it. Are there really strongly different personalities in orchestras?
Of course. Of course.
Can you talk a little more about that? Because I think we'd be curious as to why that is, or what exactly those different personalities
Because
are.
there are kind of collective groups in orchestras, maybe with people of a certain age, of a certain background, of a certain common training, of a certain experience in a previous era with some other conductor, maybe who no longer is there. All of these shared experiences have an enormous influence on the music making process, and gives them, a certain personality, which of course is very much shaped by also the conditions of their day-to-day life. I think one of the most difficult things in music making right now is that even as you approach the concert hall, for the listener and for the audience, that we have to come out of a world in which there are questions of where you're going to park your car, or if you're going to get a taxi or not, or if the current demands of information systems located in your home or business have been met, or how you stand with the IRS, or any of the other moment-to-moment, day-by-day kinds of considerations we all deal with. And then to be able to kind of step out of this world in which the whole question of question-answer is being stepped up all the time in volume and in rapidity, into a world where the composer is saying, we have all the time we want to kind of walk down this path, think over old times, reflect. Well, it's very hard to create that in a performance, especially when someone is saying, you have 3 seconds left in this rehearsal.
I suppose my real question can be boiled down to a simple one, which is, how different will a Michael Tilson Thomas performance be with the Los Angeles Philharmonic and, say, the New York Philharmonic? How different will it sound? Obviously, you have some basic conception, but what will the sounding differences be? And if you want to use different examples, that's fine, but just 2 different orchestras, same conductor, what differences?
Quite different. I mean,
how much is the conductor, how much is the orchestra? It's been said that there are no bad orchestras, just bad conductors, which sounds like hogwash to me. But
tempo in the first place. There's a tempo which is the right tempo for a particular orchestra, because they can carry it off with conviction. And that tempo might be faster or slower with one or another orchestra. So irrespective of the conception that you have an idea of what the tempo should be in that. And again, the tempo is only a question of how do you want the music to seem? What does the tempo, a certain tempo, allows you to realize a particular aspect of the music better, perhaps, than some other tempo. And you may be more interested in that aspect. So you go for that, you stack the deck a little bit on that side. Okay. So another orchestra may not be able to handle that tempo. And again, that's not just a question of playing that they can play it faster. I mean, really, there are orchestras that you can't do that tempo because it's too slow for them.
Can you expand on that a bit? I mean, I think the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the New York Philharmonic certainly very fine.
Let's take another
ensembles.
example.
Okay.
The New York Philharmonic and the Concertgebouw.
Okay.
There's a tempo that the Concertgebouw can play that the New York Philharmonic cannot, because the Concertgebouw can play a certain kind of thing slower. They can't play it with the speed or brilliance that the New York Philharmonic can play. But maybe in a certain kind of interior note glued to note mezzo forte world, they might be more comfortable and able to bring off that tempo better.
I see. So it's really a question of getting to know the orchestras and then building one's interpretation, at least partially, at least a certain percentage of it around those orchestras and one's prior knowledge.
Right. Well, what do you think an interpretation of a piece of music is?
Well, I don't know. I suppose a lot of things could be taken into account. A sort of a sense of the surface of the piece, certainly, of the actual sounding music, of, say, an inner life of the piece, because there are pieces which have very, very strong inner movements which they may not have on the outside. Many, many different things can be taken into account. How brilliant the work is, how difficult it is, which is, as you know, certainly not the same thing. How virtuosic it is, which is a third thing, and indeed. A lot of things must go into it. I assume mood must have something to do with it. If you get up to conduct a work and you're in a murderous mood, if you get up to conduct a work and you're in a good mood, I would assume the interpretation would naturally be at least some degree different. Or would you disagree with me?
Well, you've touched on a lot of things that it is. I mean, again, I think it comes back to the sense of what are the priorities that the interpreter brings. Because if the work is a universal masterpiece, it probably witnesses to a lot of things. It's like saying, what is a good interpretation of Hamlet? I always try and bring it back to theater because of my background, but I think it makes things easier to see sometimes. In the sense, you in the course of your life, if you're a Shakespearean theater buff, you'll go to a lot of performances of Hamlet. And the whole interest you have is in how they're different from one another, not how they're the same. And the interpretation may range widely, but what determines its effect, its overall effect, there may be certain moments of power which may be transporting and interesting in the performance, but finally it's a sense of, is this a consistent whole? Given that there was this flash of inspiration revealing to us the meaning behind this speech and between this stage direction and that, but was that revelation carried through so it produced a world around it which made it logical, consistent, satisfying, all of those kinds of things.
So sort of a gestalt almost, a unity.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a lot of what goes into an interpretation. Now, the Klemperer once said to me, the most high priority, the highest priority, the thing that must never be forgotten by the conductor, is that the highest priority in Western music is the projection of the form. And he said, that is not an intellectual question. That is a spiritual question. And he was right, because he, like Mahler and like Beethoven, like all these people, realized that uniquely in Western music, the relationship between the content and what happened to the content, the form of the piece, what befell the content, was the supreme drama of the symphony. And to somehow make the events, the formal pattern, the architecture of the piece assume an actual dramatic presence in the piece was really allowing the composer's voice to be heard at its clearest. And so you can have a vision of that, the way these things interrelate. Then these other things, the fact that one particular oboe player in one orchestra can play the whole phrase with no breath, and another brass section can play it really at 3 pianos instead of instead of 2 pianos, or that this particular string section has a better spiccato and this one has a better flautando, on the string, or all these other factors which you may discover in different orchestras can fit in and be part of the interpretation, but the interpretation, the concept of what the piece again speaks of, is brought by the conductor, should be brought by the conductor.
Well, I think it's time to open up the floor to some questions. I'm sure on this last evening of our series that there must be some questions which Mr. Tilson Thomas can answer. Yes, sir, your hand was up first in the back row.
They're different from performance. They don't misrepresent. They are a different kind of experience because of the conditions, presuming they're not live recordings, to some extent, even if they are live recordings. It's in another dimension. There are other factors which come into play, technical factors, accidental properties of the room in which you're working, all kinds of things like this. That something may have been done in 2 different takes, and that these takes themselves made total sense, but perhaps when intercut together produce a slightly different sense of nuance than one that was exactly what happened in the performance. I mean, it goes down to, I can tell you a story about that, I mean, which is a rather exaggerated example, but I think it's very funny. I made a recording years ago with the Los Angeles Philharmonic of the Respighi Roman pieces. And in the Fountains of Rome, at the end of the first movement, there's a flute solo. And this flute solo is accompanied by answers, a little ba-bum figure, little fanfare figures, played by first horn and first harp together in unison, and then third horn and second harp together. So that the effect is in the first, it goes ba-bum, the first little ensemble, and then ba-bum, the next one, ba-bum, ba-bum, like this. So in the recording, because of the way the orchestra was set up, which always is different from the conditions under which you have rehearsed and performed, so you have to get used to an entirely different situation in the very first minutes of the recording session. For whatever reason, it was the first horn and first harp had no difficulty in playing together, but the third horn and the second harp could not play together. So the effect was, we kept hearing this thing that went ba-bum, and then ba-ba-ga-da-ba-bum, ba-bum, da-ga-ga-ga-ga-ga, like this. So I kept trying to get it right. You play a little later, but a little sooner, it goes on and on and on. But finally you came to a point where you have to go on. There is something more of the piece than these 2 little, ba-bum, ba-bum. So, fine, forget it. All right, onward. So we went on. Later, when the mix was taking place, because of the peculiarities of this hall, because of where the microphones were, because of all these factors, as I say, what we heard on the tape was it went ba-bum, and then it went ba-bum, sort of like this. So the record comes out, and it's reviewed in the gramophone. And the first thing it says is, this recording of Respighi is fantastic for the level of imagination, coloristic, this, that is conceived. To cite only one detail, at the end of the first movement of the Fountains of Rome, Tilson Thomas has managed to get the most stunning echo effect between the 2 ensembles of the horns and the harps. It's just brilliant. It's so poetic and so fantastic and so wonderful, So, I mean, I suppose that's not the kind of story conductors really should tell about themselves. But that has something to do with why Leonard says what he says, that all of us have to have a sense of humor, a sense of persistence in working in the sessions and after the sessions, in editing the record, and I think we also all have our fingers crossed at all times that the record will come out something like we actually imagined it would.
Your hand was up at the last time.
How did you like working with Sarah Vaughan at the concert?
Well, that concert I did with Sarah Vaughan, I've done a lot of concerts with her over the years, and it was my dream always to work with Sarah Vaughan. And finally, the dream came true. I loved it. I mean, she's a real friend and great colleague. I'll be working with her again some this summer. And that's a very different experience, because when I first began playing the piano for her too, and I have played some pop music and jazz music in my life, but it's not the regular thing that I do. And we sat down, we played some things. She says, well, that is different. I like it. Great, let's just do it. So, well, let's run through this number. She said, well, no, it's good. It's good. Just let's go out on stage, and you listen to me, and I'll listen to you, and it'll be fine. I said, Sarah, this is not you have to give me a break. I spend most of my life like fixating on, is this an eighth note or a dotted eighth note? And you want me to go out and play a whole piece? Just sort of, well, listen to it. But we work it out. It's fun.
Yes.
I assume you come to a rehearsal with a particular idea of a piece in your mind's ear. How likely are you to revise that through rehearsals, or do you try to make what's in front of you match that as closely as possible?
Again, I think I always keep coming back to this word. It's a very Jewish word.
I'm sorry, let me just interrupt, because I see that some people didn't hear that. It's a question of how much, before the rehearsal, how much of the interpretation is already set in Mr. Tilson Thomas's mind. Is that a fair paraphrase? I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's not so much a specific sound. It's kavanah. It's the intent. I just keep coming back to this again and again in everything I'm saying. It's the intention. It's the way that particular sound registers with those people and that acoustic situation and everything else. So that's what I'm listening to. I mean, in the first few minutes when I'm letting the orchestra read, I'm listening a lot. I'm trying to listen, of course, all the time, but just say, aha, okay, that probably means this, and if I'm hearing this, probably out there they're hearing this, which means that, and I start asking a few questions, and begin to sort of see what is the picture, what are the possibilities, what is the spectrum in that particular place. And then within that spectrum, I want to arrange things so that the piece will make sense, will have drama. And that's how it proceeds. I think one important question nobody has asked, and you haven't referred to, Tim, but I want to talk about. Music, as I tell my students and I tell myself, music is a lifetime of staying in training and studying. And one of the major parts of studying that I do is work in the score which leads to library work. That is to say, I work very closely with librarians who work for me and with the librarians of the major symphony orchestras that I conduct in preparing sets of materials, which are my own sets of materials. Most frequently now I travel with all of the material. All the music that I am doing on the concert is played from my own music. And as my conceptions evolve in this music is increasingly marked in greater detail and yet more simply to express exactly the conception that I want in the piece. And this saves an enormous amount of rehearsal time and makes the achieving of a personal performance possible under some of the very limited time frames that we have to work in now.
Yes.
Why apart, in your opinion, apart from Sarah Vaughan, are there no women conductors?
Well, there are many more women conductors now. They're really beginning to appear on the scene. I mean, I think we're all very anxiously awaiting the emergence of a really great, forceful-minded woman conductor. I've had some very excellent women students. One interesting thing about them is all the women students I've had were about 5 to 10 years older than their male counterparts. I think that had to do with that until recently, maybe for women to actually make the decision to go out on a limb to take this position of authority and to assume this role in the context of music makers took them a little bit further on in their own lives to decide that that was the thing that they really could do, because it's the deck certainly was still stacked against them in terms of just what the conventions, the predictable conventions of conducting have been. But I feel sure now that because of Sarkawa, because of Eve Queller, because of Judith Simoji, because of Catherine Comey, because of many very active professionals who are out there, that it must be entering more and more into the consciousness of young women that, let's say in their teens, when many people decide they want to be conductors, that this really is a possibility for them. And that will be an enormous difference in these next years to see women coming forward from that early part of their lives.
Yes, ma'am.
Ask Mr. Thomas, what's about Antonia Brigham? What's happening to her?
I have no idea, ma'am.
Mr. Thomas, I hope you'll forgive me if I get personal.
Not necessarily.
Let's see. I heard a concert and saw you conduct in Israel about 18 years ago.
Mhm.
Possible so far back?
It's possible.
And I remember the intermission when the entire audience, I think, ran down the aisle showering you with flowers. And then I came home to my home in Beverly Hills at the time, my husband and I told my daughter, who played the viola, what about this wonderful concert with this nice young conductor. I said his name was Michael Tilson Thomas. And she said, oh, I know Michael Tilson Thomas. He was one of the people in the Idle on Earth Orchestra, and he went with us to England and Wales. They were about 16 years old at the time. I think Michael was, my daughter was, and so on. And I said, and what did the kids think? She says, well, they thought he was a very fine musician and also a very nice guy. And so I think the same.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice of you to say. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Two questions. Which orchestras do you consider the best orchestras in the United States from the sound viewpoint? And secondly, which orchestra would you like to be music director and
To the first question, it must be the Atlanta Symphony. They just won all the Grammys, right? And to the second question, my own. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about the Great Woods Performing Arts Center, how you got involved in it, why another summer festival, and why it's so important to you?
I became involved with the Great Woods Festival through my association with the Pittsburgh Symphony, an orchestra I've worked very happily with under a lot of different circumstances over many years now. And it was a possibility to establish not only a concert series, which would be an exciting new facility, which is a brand new facility, amazing undertaking in this day and age to build such a thing. And it have great sight lines and great acoustics, and it had has a pit, and had possibilities of doing opera and dance and music theater and a really wide range of things. And also it had the possibility of developing an institute around it. And this is very important to me, the idea of these summer courses and teaching in an idealistic framework some of the kinds of principles in music which I was taught and which sustain me and have left my idealism very much intact even after all these very many years of professional life. That's a very important thing. And those two things I hoped would, as they did in the project I ran like this in Los Angeles, have a very good beneficial effect upon one another. I think over a period of time the young musicians learn a lot from the professionals, and the professionals delight and relish their experience with the young musicians, and everybody kind of rediscovers happily their special relationship with music.
Yes, sir.
in opera, in Carmen or Dukes of Feo, for example, there are many different versions that are, quote,
Mm-hmm.
You made a comment just now that you carry your own conductor scores around with you, which you mark. You run into the problem of getting to an orchestral situation where your score is different from the one that they're accustomed to using because there are different versions of it?
Well, I think maybe you misunderstood me. It's not my score that I'm marking, it's the actual parts that each player has. In other words, I travel with my own first, second, and oboe part, and viola part, and everybody, I bring everybody's music. So their music is in concord with my score.
Isn't that the case with all conductors?
No.
I have a question. How can you conduct, for instance, a Mozart or a Pierre Boulez with the same emotion?
I don't conduct them with the same emotion.
Well, I would like to know the feeling, the difference that you feel between a Mozart and a Pierre Boulez.
You mean how I perceive those two different things? Well, I perceive in general, the music of Mozart being a highly subtle, ever-changing, balance point again. I mean, it's something very, very cantabile maybe and very spiritual, but also has little twists. That's very hard to describe Mozart's. What is the? I mean, that's the whole thing. It's interesting about Mozart's music is that it is so amazingly universal and abstract and subtle and full of turns at every particular corner, and that those turns are coming out of the simplest little interrelationships of musical materials which were used by all kinds of other people, but somehow in his hands were they did assume a meaning and a significance far greater than anyone ever suspected those particular notes could have. And his moods are unclassifiable and always changing, even though the materials are very simple. In the case of, I don't want to put one particular composer into this classification, but in much contemporary music, it is true that very often there is a very complicated surface, a very complicated presentation of musical ideas, which actually often disguises the fact that there may be only one emotion present, such as, for example, intellectual rage.
Yes.
What kind of goals do you set for yourself in your development as a conductor?
Would you say that again?
Did everyone hear that?
I'm assuming that you aren't 100% satisfied with yourself and willing to just...
No, I'm hoping I'm a work in progress, absolutely.
So what kind of goals do you set for yourself for the future, for yourself as a conductor?
Well, I'd like to be a lot clearer. I'm a lot clearer than I used to be. I'd still like to be clearer. I believe very much that very often in a musical situation, again, there can be a number of things that are not right. In other words, that's a very common thing for young conductors. They stand in front of an orchestra and they know it doesn't sound good. They know it doesn't sound right. But they're not sure exactly why it doesn't sound right. And as you go along, you can get more adept at being able to see exactly what it is, until finally, instead of dealing with all of these various things that are wrong, you can say, it's this. It's the second 16th note, the D sharp, which is something, whatever. I mean, or it's whatever it may be. It may be something as specific that, it may be something more general about, where something has to be played in an instrument, or maybe it may be a word, it may be a poetic suggestion, but whatever it is, but it's this thing. And that on touching on that, immediately, the whole thing is right. It's like magic, but it really can happen. Sometimes you even just, it's as simple as just saying, don't fight with one another, play together beautifully. Bang, it can be right. If it's, sometimes you have a situation like a Mozart piano concerto, the winds are playing a little line in unison, against the piano, and it's all marked piano, but it's kind of like they're all thinking, well, it's piano all right, but somebody's going to be the loudest, and I'm going to make sure that it's me, And if you point that out to them and just say, let's stop fighting with one another, just blend and just be with the music, and suddenly so it can be sometimes a personal thing, sometimes a technical thing. But that's great, just to be able to solve that magically. It's like being a faith healer, kind of, sometimes, you can say.
Yes, sir.
One of the musicians has an interpretation of one of the parts that you wrote for them or with your field, and it's different from yours. And for some reason, maybe even you in your thinking would agree that maybe his idea goes along with your way of expressing it better. Would you lose face in front of an orchestra if you said, you're right, or how do you handle that?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I would be very grateful to discover an idea that was a better idea and that would make the piece speak whatever it needs to do at that moment more clearly.
And you don't have to worry that, there's going to be whispering in the orchestra or something like that.
No, because I think that, if the rest of the conception is good, the idea that I would have the openness, the confidence and the appreciation of them, and that they really are thinking and participating in the music-making process with me, that's something we all want, that we all want from one another as musicians. I think it's very important.
Yes, we'll take 2 more questions.
When you have a soloist playing with an orchestra, how much does the soloist have to say in how they play or how they play with the orchestra, and how much do you have a say-so in?
It depends very much on the particular piece. It depends very much on the personalities of the soloists. But my view of it is that a concerto exists because there is an opportunity for a soloist to appear. The interest of the audience very much is in encountering the spirit of this performer, the electricity of this soloist. And that most people tend to play better when they feel secure, loved, and supported in what they're doing. If what the soloist wants to do, I feel, fits within, again, the overall shape of what the piece is, I'm inclined to give them a great deal of support and a very great deal of freedom and help in accomplishing what they want to do. If I feel that they are, in some cases, working against the music, or even worse, working against themselves, perhaps, I will also try to make that point with them. But if it's in terms of erring on one side or another, I'm more inclined to let them do what it is they want to do if I feel they can really bring it off. A very great member of an orchestra once said to me, he said, Michael, we've played these pieces so many times, and we thought that the right way to play was this. And then someone came, no, it was this other way to play it was. And it went back and forth. Different years, there were kind of different fashions of this was the right way, and this was the wrong way. He said, but really, we don't know anymore what is the right way or the wrong way to play these pieces. What we know is that every once in a while, somebody shows up who's so convinced about what it is he wants to do and puts it over so powerfully, so directly, so movingly, that it goes across the footlights and it carries the day. And that's what music making really is about. So if a soloist has that kind of authority to do what he wants to do, you respect that a lot. Now, on the other hand, it can happen, as I was once working with a young pianist, Russian pianist, and we were working and we were playing in Rachmaninoff Third Concerto, and we came to a section in the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto, and it said, Here, he said a little bit faster, strictly in tempo and a little bit faster. And she went slower and played with a lot of rubato. And I asked her about this. I said, will you tell me why when the composer says go faster and play strictly in tempo and you go slower and play with rubato? Why do you do that? She said, because here is opportunity to display personality. I said, what? He said, yes, in first movement are 3 opportunities to display personality. Here, 3 bars after G, and just before coda comes last one.
Who won
So
that
what I did was, I pulled things into line. What I did actually was I allowed her to demonstrate her personality in one of those places. The inevitable catastrophe resulting from that was not repeated at the next performance. No, I mean, I warned her, but she was insistent on doing a particular thing which I knew would have difficult results in the performance. But she had to discover that. She had to discover that for herself.
Yes, one more question.
Yes, I want to pick up on certain phrases that we used here. This gentleman in the back mentioned something about losing face. He mentioned whispering in the orchestra, which was an implication of the possibility of contention, rivalry, etc., etc. Now, you sounded very assured at the beginning when you spoke about your ability to control, and you have your interpretation. I wondered to what extent the implications of whispering, of losing face, is it a sense of your own security, the kind of thing that a psychiatrist and psychologist would say, if you're not secure and your ego is challenged, you're going to fight back, but if you are totally secure, then you will accept. Yes?
I'm not sure whether I should answer that yes or no. You've answered your own question very effectively.
I just wonder about this business of losing space and whispering in the orchestra. It somehow rather struck me.
You see, it really works like this. You can handle the situation because you understand it, and to some degree you have compassion for people who are locked into the particular purgatory they've built for themselves. But finally, most of us who are in this international music environment we find ourselves, such as the people that you've been hearing speaking on this series, if we're really not happy, we don't come back.
That's one thing.
There are a lot of places for us to make music, and a lot of people who are very happy to make music with us and want to cooperate with us in a friendly way. There are more of those places than we can go in a year. So if it really becomes an element of contentiousness, it just is fine, great, so we go here, go there, we do whatever it is we do. But you see, those things work in cycles too. I mean, you look at the rosters of different orchestras over periods of time, you can see, aha, here was a period where maestro X, Y, and Z were a lot with this orchestra, and then suddenly you see, oh, well, a different personality maybe came in as music director, or someone's priorities moved into some other direction, and so then suddenly another group of people kind of in that period of years were here, and then suddenly this orchestra kind of discovered this other person afresh, and that happened, and these things move around a little bit. And I think over a period of years in the music profession, that the veterans in the music profession recognize that very likely in music you will see your colleagues again a lot in some other time, in some other situation. And that maybe some of the things that separated you from working together at one point will unite you at another point. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you find it strange what
Do I find it strange?
How can it be that happen?
Well, that issue happened over a very sound musical principle.
On the part of Karajan or on the part of the orchestra?
On the part of Karajan. Which didn't, I mean, it had nothing, the publicity of that event was that it had a lot to do with the Berlin Philharmonic was refusing to accept a woman member of the orchestra, but it had nothing to do with that at all. It had to do with that in the case of a principal player of the orchestra not being there, that the player would, I think the word is deputize another player to play in his stead. And von Karajan was saying in the event of that happening that he, von Karajan, wanted to have a right of approval over the player who was deputized, so that the player would be satisfactory for his standard of music making. And that was, I think, fairly reasonable principle, particularly as involved recording and touring and many other things which are involved with the whole image of the orchestra. Yes.
Let's take one last question.
There's the physicians for social responsibility, educators, others. Is there an organization, musicians for social responsibility? And how do you feel about taking a stand on nuclear arms and on the subjects of today?
Did you all hear the question? Well, there are some organizations like Artists to End Hunger, I think. I mean, and there are various organizations, and they're.
About social responsibility, about nuclear arms.
You're talking about social responsibility. Yes, there are also associations of artists. Who, that's right, musicians, various groups, and these groups tend to form form again according to the nature of the particular social crisis which is going on. And I certainly have been a member of some organizations where I felt that the organization had a very focused, specific point that it was trying to make that I could support.
Well, thank you all very much for coming to tonight and on the other nights of the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Real pleasure.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.